Very good afternoon to you. You're watching Politics Unscripted. Let's get into this conversation now. Writing in his capacity as executive in residence at the Gordon Institute of Business Science, Andile Sangqu wrote last March that the worst case scenario of disorder and decay awaited the country unless it changed priorities. Have the chickens indeed come home to roost? Andile Sangqu now joins us to discuss what scenarios remain most ideal to lift the country from the current fiasco. Sangqu, thank you very much for your time and latching on that very worst case scenario that would play out, the events of the past week. Is it what you predicted, or is the worst still to come?
Good afternoon to you and to the viewers. I think it's important just to take a step back before dealing with that question, just to trace the history of these Indulamithi scenarios. We started these scenarios back in 2017, 2018, and the reason being that during times of uncertainty and during times of crisis, it's always very important to start thinking about the future in pathways. In other words, to start thinking about the possible futures, the positive ones, and also the negative ones. So we came up with 3 scenarios when we did our work. And the first one was what we referred to as the Isibhujwa. All these scenarios are named after a dance move. So we came up with this one called Isibhujwa, which depicts an enclave bourgeoisie nation characterized by deepening social divides, daily protests, and cynical self-interest. And the second scenario that we came up with is most positive out of the 3, which is a nation in step with itself. And that one, you know, it characterizes a very confident spirit, a renewed spirit of constitutionalism. It talks about a growing social cohesion, and then it talks about economic expansion. And I must add that, that these scenarios, we're trying to fast forward and say how the future would look like by year 2030. Yeah. And then the third one is the Gwara Gwara scenario. So this really characterizes a scenario where there's a floundering false dawn in the country. In other words, this is a country that has immobility and restless energy. And lastly, that it talks to a country that is demoralized and is a land of disorder and decay. Yeah. So when the article was put together, you know, in March, it was basically saying that there are fault lines in our society that even predate the onset of COVID-19. And therefore something needs to be done to address those fault lines. Yeah. I think the events of the last week, all that they did was to basically exploit those fault lines that were already in existence. In fact, what they have done, they had hastened the need to move with urgency and speed, you know, to address some of our underlying problems, which I must say they do, A, precede the last week's unrest, and 2, they even precede the onset of COVID pandemic.
Sure. Talking about exploiting the fault lines that already exist, the targeting of economic centers for looting, what does that tell us about the widening gap of poverty and inequality?
Well, I mean, there are 2 sides to this. One, I don't think it would be fair to say that the the fault lines in our society are only limited to those two areas, that is KZN and Gauteng, even though they are, in terms of scale, they are probably far worse than others because A, of the numbers of population, and two, also the density of those two centers. So that in itself sort of breeds more of this kind of escalation of unrest and violence. However, let me add to say that, if you look at provinces like the Eastern Cape and many others, there is really a preponderance of poverty and inequality in those areas. But what is important also to acknowledge about these particular centers that you have mentioned is the fact that they are also economic hubs, so anything that is likely to hurt the economy is likely to happen in those areas. Two, the inequalities may be even far more on the spotlight in relation to those two centers that you're talking about.
Sangqu, there is the notion that the events of the past week were acts of sabotage, and some say that if you look at the targeting of water treatment plants, for example, it points to that issue of sabotage. I want to ask of you whether or not we had sabotage, planned sabotage. There is a view that the scenes of looting that we saw, what they manifested is a looming crisis of hunger in the country, particularly the hunger of 30 million citizens. Do you agree with that outlook?
Well, let me start with the last one. I agree with the fact that there is hunger in our society. I agree with the fact that there is inequality in our society. And I agree with the observation that, all the events of the past week, one thing that they have done, they have just accentuated, those fault lines, and also sort of created a spotlight for us to be able to make sure that those are addressed as a matter of urgency. With regards to economic sabotage, it's very difficult to tell because there would be an investigation, as the president has said, so it would be very presumptuous to say that the reasons of the unrest were sabotage. However, because people are generally hungry because of these historical economic legacies that exist, it was easy to exploit those vulnerabilities. Whether or not, and in my view, I think that anything could have lit the fire because people are hungry and these inequalities are growing in our society. So I won't particularly say that this has really been the cause of this. I think anything could have caused the situation that we're in. Because of all of these factors that I have mentioned, I think we were rife, to find ourselves in that situation. And I must also add to say that unless and until something is done, we can't just think that this calm, is really a permanent one, because of these fault lines, unless and until we do something about them.
In your article last year, you wrote that social cohesion is at the core of South Africa's development plan. What does it look like? What does it look like? And importantly, is it attainable by the year 2030?
Look, let's start here, Polile, and say that if we think about the South Africa that we have today, it is a product of a negotiated settlement. In other words, everyone was included to try and negotiate the kind of future that we wanted. And part of that meant, some trade-offs. It meant some sacrifices, it meant some compromises for the attainment of the greater good. So I think that the social compact is important because what it does is that it helps us, number one, not to point fingers, to say, well, if this hadn't happened, X, Y, Z would not have happened. Two, is the social compacting is to say to everyone that we should not wait for other people to do things for us. We are the leaders that we have been waiting for. And therefore, it's important for us to A, share information, and to negotiate out of all of these three scenarios that Indulamithi has outlined, which is the most favorable scenario that we all want to pursue. And therefore, what are some of those things that we need to do collectively to make sure that we, as a country and as people and as society, we can be able to gravitate towards that. That's the first thing. The second one is to say, what are some of the things that we need to do or ought to do to help us to avoid the less desirable scenarios? So the social compacting process, number one, is not new to South Africa. And two, there is no other way we will be able to get ourselves out of the situation that we are in. And it's not fair to think or assume that government alone would be able to bootstrap us out of the situation that we are in. So in other words, we need all hands on deck. And part of the social compacting is to facilitate the conversation, is to facilitate a dialogue. It is enable every voice to be heard. It is to enable everyone to express the desires that we need economically, socially, and otherwise. And finally, to say, we have in our preamble to our constitution the kind of desired future that we want. So through a social compacting process, how can we then give concrete expression and reality to that desired future? So at the heart of all of this, it's really to create a space for dialogue and conversations.
Dr. Sangqu, in 1 minute, are you able to tell us that we can avoid the last scenario that you painted? You painted 3 scenarios. The last one was most scary for me because you said if we are a country that is restless and floundering, that seems very scary. How closer are we to that scenario in the current environment of economic depression? Because I think we've gone beyond a recession. We are in economic depression right now.
Well, Toli, I mean, we predicted that we will be in that scenario by 2030, but the evidence that is coming through our barometer is that we are actually quickly gravitating towards that scenario. So it may well be that we are already there in some areas, but we are closely gravitating towards that. However, as we are in this critical juncture, it is also, we are gifted with an opportunity as well to rebuild and to take advantage of this imbalance that has been created, to say, what is it that we can do as a collective? What is it that we can do today, not tomorrow, to make sure that we gravitate towards the more positive scenarios? I'm afraid to say that time is running out, and we need all leaders of society, business, government, trade unions, religious leaders, everybody to say where to from here. And that ought to happen today. Not tomorrow, today.
Andile Sangqu, thank you very much for your time, sir. He is the chairperson at the Indulamithi SA Scenarios 2030. Thank you indeed for that scenario planning. Well, in the next hour, we dive deep into the uncensored debate. This is